em ra ngoài thảo luận nhé, vì nếu không sẽ ảnh hưởng.
Xin được chào mừng các vị đại biểu, các vị khách quý.
Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to extend a warm welcome to you for participating into our roundtable today on finance and governance for just energy transition. Ladies and gentlemen, as you may have known, at the 2021 COP26, the Vietnamese government made a commitment to achieve net zero of 2050, and this is a ground for a series of important energy policies shift of the government of Vietnam and investors in the field of energy. And the outstanding issue is the transition from fossil fuels to clean and renewable energy sources to fulfill the commitment of COP and to meet SDGs. So the question is, what do we need to do in order to ensure a just transition, and what are the effective finance and governance mechanism to ensure that this will be a reality? And that is why today we have this joint table jointly organized by UNDP and Vietnam Investment Review, and this will be a forum for us to discuss experiences and lessons learned in order to draw up lessons for green finance in Vietnam. And I would like to introduce to you the distinguished guests and VIPs today.
Sao tự nhiên lại dừng lại nhỉ?
Xin trân trọng giới thiệu bà Kani Việt Nam.
We have Ms. Kani Wignaraja, UN Assistant Secretary General, UNDP Assistant Administrator and Regional Director of the Regional Bureau for Asia and the Pacific. And from the expert community, business community, and investors who are going to present at today's roundtable, we have Dr. Phạm Xuân Hoe, former Vice Chairman of the Institute of Banking Strategy, Professor Ulrich Wolf and Thomas Maurer from the University of London. Ms. Kenna Barrow-Clough, a senior economist of UNCTAD. Ms. Michelle Wee, CEO Standard Chartered Bank of Vietnam. Ms. Phạm Nguyễn Ngọc Thương, Deputy CEO and CFO of BCG Energy Joint Stock Company. Mr. John Rockhold, Pacific Rim Investment and Management. Mr. Bùi Trung Kiên, Vice Chairman of CME Solar. And Ms. Đỗ Lê Thu Ngọc, Assistant to the Resident Representative of UNDP Vietnam and Head of the Inclusive Growth Unit of UNDP Vietnam. She's going to be the moderator today as well. And Ms. Kathleen Wilson, Resident Representative of UNDP Vietnam. Mr. Lê Trọng Minh, Editor-in-Chief of Vietnam Investment Review. We would like to thank all of the reporters and the central media agencies and media agencies in Hanoi for coming to join us and covering our event. And this event is broadcasted in Vietnamese on Vietnam Investment Review and in English on on UNDP website. And we also have two participants joining with us through Zoom. And now we'd like to invite to the stage Ms. Kathleen Wilson, Resident Representative of UNDP, to deliver her opening remark.
Em lên trên kia xem chất lượng âm thanh thế nào.
Ms. Connie Wignaraja, UN Assistant Secretary General and UNDP Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific. Mr. Lê Trong Minh, Editor-in-Chief of Vietnam Investment Review. Good afternoon, Xin chào. Thank you very much for joining us today for this roundtable event on finance and governance accelerators for a just energy transition. I am very pleased to see so many participants in the room and online, given it is Friday afternoon. So thank you again for taking time at your end of the week schedule to join us. At the outset, I would like to thank Mr. Lê Trong Minh, Editor-in-Chief of the Vietnam Investment Review, for hosting the roundtable in this wonderful venue and for your leadership in organizing the event. We are also delighted to welcome in person Ms. Connie Wignaraja, our Regional Director, who is here in Vietnam for a 3-day special country visit. This roundtable on finance and governance accelerators for a just energy transition is the first of a series of discussions we intend to hold with the government of Vietnam to clarify what are the most suitable policy options as Vietnam seeks to attract finance for its transition to net zero. At COP26 in November 2021, Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh made a commitment to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050 and phase out of coal power. The Prime Minister has also just approved the National Climate Change Strategy, which sets out a clear roadmap to meet net carbon emissions by 2050. In terms of context, as we know, Vietnam is faced today with the impetus of maintaining high rates of economic growth while meeting climate and energy transition commitments in ways that are just. At the same time, the demand for energy needed for economic growth will increase significantly. As a manufacturing hub, businesses and sectors will continue to demand increasing sources of energy. And at the same time, as we shift to fossil fuel-based energy to renewable. Recording in progress. Thank you. As we know well, and I think many of you know here, the challenges we have are threefold. The first is investing in renewable power generation. Secondly, is investing in energy efficiency and energy transition, especially of transport, industry, construction, and agricultural sectors. And thirdly, is protecting workers and the vulnerable. In the roundtable this afternoon, we are discussing and unpacking key factors, policy, technical, financial, social, and governance that could help accelerate a just energy transition and attract green investment and create a conducive environment for private business, both national and international, to contribute. I would like to, at this time, thank our speakers and our panelists who are bringing to this roundtable a very diverse set of perspectives, from policy to private sector and business, to experts in the banking sector. Your perspectives will help us to identify the most pressing bottlenecks that, if unlocked, will help increase the flow of finance for a just energy transition. Thank you to our speakers, Mr. Pham Xuan Ho, Professor Ulrich Volz, and Thomas Marwa, who are joining us from London virtually. And it is also a pleasure to welcome Ms. Michelle Wu, CEO of Standard Chartered Bank, Ms. Phan Vu Ngoc Thong, Deputy CEO and CFO of DCG Energy, and Ms. Huy Trong Kien from CNE Solar, Mr. John Rockhold, President of Pacific Rim Investment and Management, and Ms. Diana Baroklov from UNCTAD, who will be joining us virtually from Geneva. Thank you for your participation in this panel and for bringing your expertise and perspectives to bear. Ladies and gentlemen, you will hear from experts today about the opportunities and the challenges in developing a green finance market in Vietnam and lessons learned from other countries in financing a just transition. We welcome your ideas and contributions to this discussion on the best mix of policies, both immediate and longer term, to help Vietnam accelerate its energy transition to a net zero emission future. really look forward to a frank, engaging discussion and debate, the first in a series of roundtables to come. So without further ado, thank you, Sim Kang Eun, and I wish you all great health and a fantastic session this afternoon. Thank you.
Xin trân trọng cảm ơn bà Kelsey.
Thank you very much, Ms. Caitlin Wilson. And next, we'd like to invite to the stage Mr. Lê Trọng Minh, Editor-in-Chief of Vietnam Investment Review, to deliver his opening remark. Ms. Kani Wignaraja, UN Assistant Secretary General, UNDP Assistant Administrator, and Regional Director of the Regional Bureau of Asia and the Pacific, Ms. Caitlin Wilson, Resident Representative of UNDP Vietnam, ladies and gentlemen, representatives of organizations, agencies in the business community, representatives of the mass media, participants to this roundtable on-site and online. First of all, on behalf of the editing board of the Vietnam Investment Review, I'd like to thank Ms. Kani Wignaraja, UN Assistant Secretary General, UNDP Assistant Administrator, and Regional Director of the Regional Bureau of the Asian and Pacific, to set aside valuable time from her busy schedule to attend our roundtable today. I would like to warmly welcome and thank Ms. Caitlin Wilson, Resident Representative of UNDP Vietnam, and all of you for setting aside your valuable time at the end of a working week to join our roundtable today. I would like to thank UNDP for selecting Vietnam Investment Review as your reliable partner to organize this roundtable on governance and finance for just energy transition. And this is a highly meaningful event in the face of very rapid developments globally and domestically. I hope that we will have a meaningful and interesting roundtable offering you a diverse range of perspectives. Ladies and gentlemen, the ambitious goal of Vietnam set out in COP26 to achieve net zero by 2050, it offers both challenges and opportunities for Vietnam to attract resources in order to realize SDGs. In the meeting of the National Steering Committee for implementing COP26 commitments, Prime Minister Phạm Minh Chính said that green growth will be very important in fulfilling our COP26 commitments. Our strategy to 2030 with a vision to 2050 was approved on the 1st of October 2021, and then on the 22nd of July 2022, at Decision 882, the Prime Minister issued the National Action Plan on Green Growth for period 2021 to 2030. According to this, the plan and the strategy aims at four important goals. The first one is to reduce per capita GDP emission. The second one is to make green different economic sectors. The third one is to make green consumption and other living standards. The fourth one, improving resilience and equality. The National Action Plan on Green Growth recently issued aims to realize the different objectives in order to ensure economic sustainability and social equality. The implementation of this action plan is very important to realize Vietnam international commitment in COP26 to achieve net zero by 2050 in order to contribute actively to limit the global warming. As per Vietnam's NDC commitments, the commitments that Vietnam made in COP26 is reflected in our different actions, 18 groups of actions and 134 tasks in the National Green Growth Action Plan. While we face with significant financial challenges, according to the World Bank recently announced CCDR, in order to implement the climate adapted green growth roadmap with net zero, Vietnam will need to invest another 6.8% of GDP or 368 billion USD from now until 2040. We should focus on energy, industry, transport, and agriculture, and we need the involvement of all relevant agencies, the business community, and the entire society in order to implement the defined activities. And we need to mobilize resources and improve finance and governance for a just energy transition. Ladies and gentlemen, energy transition does not only involve technologies, but it needs the involvement of the entire economic sector. And while the shift to clean sources of energy is seen as a positive move, however, energy transition requires a colossal amount of finance for both developed and developing countries. In particular, for developing countries, the identification of a suitable financial model that aligns with our level of development is very important. While looking into the very tense negotiation on climate change over the many years to aid, while developed countries play a very, very important role as well. And in this context, it is important to reach a partnership model with involvement of relevant stakeholders. And the just energy transition model is important in order to unlock economic and political bottlenecks globally. And in that sense, I hope that the roundtable today will act as important catalyst for an exchange of opinion and perspective between international and local entities to come up with an optimal model for Vietnam and for other countries at similar level of development to enable just energy transition to green growth and response to climate change in the coming time, and with the necessary investment and the goal to achieve major balance in the fiscal space and macroeconomy. However, given that the capital market in Vietnam is still too moderate and the limited number of financial instruments, we cannot on our own finance the necessary investment. So we hope that experts from the banking sector and private sector can join hands with us to analyze and to propose solutions to unlock the bottlenecks in order to enable a just energy transition process and achieve the goals that have been set out. Finally, I wish all of you happiness, health, and success. And according to the Asian tradition, today is the first of the lunar month. So I wish all of you a very fortunate and happy new month. Thank you very much. And I wish that our roundtable will come to a great success. Thank you very much.
Xin trân trọng cảm ơn ông Lê Trọng Minh, Tổng biên tập báo đầu tư.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lê Trọng Minh, Vietnam Investment Review Editor-in-Chief. And ladies and gentlemen, we are going to have a keynote speech that serves as a ground for future presentations. And this is about the just energy transition, finance and governance. We would like to invite to the stage Ms. Kani Wignaraja, UN Assistant Secretary General and UNDP Assistant Administrator, Regional Director of the Regional Bureau for Asia and the Pacific. Các anh ở bên em, anh nào nói.
Join Caitlin in thanking Mr. Lê Chong Min, Editor-in-Chief of VIR, for hosting, and all of you for joining us today. This special roundtable on transitioning to a just energy future will pay particular attention to the financial and governance challenges that this transition will entail. So although there's a lot more to be talked about, we do want you to focus in on these two specific issues. Now, the idea of a just energy transition is not a new one. It has been circulating in academic and advocacy circles since the 1980s. So in fact, it was something that we were discussing when I first came to work in Vietnam, which was exactly 20 years ago. But it's still good that we're having a continued conversation, and the conversation has evolved. Now, in the first time we actually formally used this term was in the preamble to the 2015 Paris Agreement. So it took on a very different international connotation at the time. Now the ambition, if the reason we're not calling it an energy transition, but a just energy transition, is that, as you know, the hope is that while we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we will also ensure access to affordable, reliable, more sustainable, and modern sources and supply of energy for all people. Now you add to that the issue of energy security, which we weren't talking about in the same way until a couple of years ago, and in fact, in the current global context, this has become absolutely critical with global crises and the war in Ukraine that has disrupted the existing energy demand and supply equations. So all countries, including Vietnam, wish to rapidly become energy secure. Now, energy is also at the heart of so much more. For example, if we have a limited access to electricity, it is an obvious obstacle to achieve the other SDGs, including ending poverty and hunger, universal access to health services, technology, and education, just to name a few. None of this will happen without light and power, quite literally. So we now have evidence that the transition to renewable energy will create more jobs than it will replace. This was always a big concern in the developing world. Although it will create gaps and winners and losers in the labor market in the short term, countries that manage the transition well will plan ahead for this, knowing that the new jobs will not necessarily be created where the old ones are lost, nor where they are needed most. So education, skills upgrading, and standing social protection systems will be key components of the justness of the energy transition. And new jobs in new tech and manufacturing sectors must also quite specifically target those otherwise left behind. There is also an obvious international dimension to this just energy transition. Climate extremes in the form of floods, droughts, sea level rise hit poor and marginalized communities the hardest. Now, many of these communities are in developing countries, in which carbon per capita carbon emissions are much lower than in the industrialized world. While new development models are being sought, where one can achieve sustainable development progress while decarbonizing, it is also important that wealthy nations and the global and domestic capital markets support developing countries, particularly LDCs and SIDS, make this transition faster without having to sacrifice progress on overall human and planetary well-being. The transition to renewable energy, we know, carries a cost. In its country climate development report, the World Bank recently cited the huge figure of $368 billion for Vietnam from now until 2040. This is a significant investment. But please ask, is it really a question of how much money, or is it something else that doesn't have us accelerating this energy transition? So yes, there are costs to be borne, no matter where the money comes from. Although wind and solar have lower overall operating costs, they are more capital intensive in their startup than traditional coal and gas-fired power plants. Electricity grids will need upgrading to move power from surplus to deficit regions and to balance peaks and troughs in demand. Production methods in industry and agriculture will need to be modernized to make the shifts. A tough sector is transport. Mass transit systems will be need to invest in clean energy sources, and that includes e-vehicles, the rails, charging stations, a whole ecosystem to support the new mobility. So people who now use their petrol and diesel-powered vehicles will have to adjust. Now, this behavior change is needed, and what else is needed will be a change in the vested interests and social dynamics involved, and we should not underestimate that. So let me talk to a few areas that what we would posit is that the volume of capital does exist in the public and private sectors, and that the real question around financing a just energy transition may have more to do with how to get that money efficiently and transparently to the investments that need it. Now, in development finance, we know two words are critical: profitability and predictability. These are key factors that move capital. So we need to test the hypothesis that if the right policies and incentives are in place, then both the state sector and businesses need to generate profitable, bankable energy projects that become high-value investment propositions. Interestingly, Vietnam's recent solar boom illustrates. Began just in 2018, continued through 2021, including through the pandemic years, and showed that given the right policy mix, that financing was forthcoming. Now, fixed-in tariffs set at a relatively high level was ensured that approved solar power projects generated revenue on the scale required to cover the cost of capital. While these fixed feed-in tariffs worked in the short term, they are an expensive solution, given the rapid pace of technological change and the falling costs of renewable power generation. New technologies will continue to drive the price down. So setting high feed-in tariffs soon reduces the competitive pressures to lower prices and suddenly makes coal and gas appear more competitive than they actually are. So there are lessons learned here in Vietnam and elsewhere in countries that have remained committed to a just energy transition, even when buffeted by current global economic and energy market trends. And this helps us consider a few proposals that I would like to share with you today. Let me start with the most obvious, that this cannot be left to markets alone. Government continues to need to play a key role as an early catalyst and risk absorber, investing in essential physical infrastructure and, very importantly, as the presenter and guardian of an attractive, predictable regulatory environment for profitable investments in renewables. Second, and not easy, Vietnam will need to develop and finance a smart national grid. In most developing countries, including here, the current national electricity grid just cannot accommodate both the huge growth in energy demand that is expected, nor the extra supply. Investment in the electricity grid is a precondition for sustained investment in renewable energy. So smart grid technology that is available and uses artificial intelligence to purchase power at the lowest price and balance energy supply and demand across locations and over time will eventually help to replace fixed feed-in tariffs and also reduce perverse incentives. Third, and something already being considered here, is introducing carbon taxes. Investment in an upgraded grid, and for some contexts that require off-grid solutions, can come from the usual sources, including taxation and domestic bond sales. It can also come from carbon taxes. Where done well, this not only generates revenues for public investment, but also encourages businesses and households to use energy more efficiently. An emissions trading system that caps the total amount of emissions but allows low-emission industries to sell their allowances to more carbon-intensive industries can be optimized, but it does entail transparent pricing and high monitoring and enforcement costs, We're in fact seeing how this is working currently close by in Singapore. So it is an achievable goal for Vietnam. And in the meantime, and fourth, a simple tax on fossil fuels is easy to administer and offers a good interim alternative. Taxing petrol is politically unpopular everywhere in the world, but it is a progressive tax that falls more on the wealthy. And all this calls for is reducing and removal of fossil fuel subsidies that have long been a high cost on public budgets. Specific fuel subsidy support to the poorest households can be a targeted support provided through the employer or other means to help the burden on the poor. Fifth, it's a consideration of green bonds, which are another option for public investment projects, particularly those that require imports of capital goods and technologies. If investor interest in green bonds is sufficiently high, they can provide a cost-effective alternative or additional source to other sources of borrowing. However, for this to be floated, it cannot be done independently of developing a deeper domestic banking sector. This leads me to a sixth and finally to the proposal of a national energy bank. Many countries have created specialized banks to expand the supply of long-term financing for large energy projects. They provide guarantees for commercial bank loans, organize structured finance for low gestating projects, and take an equity stake in projects that deliver important social and environmental benefits. The involvement of private investors and foreign institutional partners in the governance of these institutions ensures that they operate on a commercial basis and do not rely or have to rely on government funding. We have examples in Germany, in Brazil, the Korean Development Bank. They can borrow cheaply on domestic and international capital markets and use their financial power to stimulate domestic lending by commercial banks and other financial institutions. This certainly becomes an attractive potential option for Vietnam. Now, the Prime Minister of Vietnam's announcement at COP26 that was bold and ambitious, that Vietnam will achieve net zero emissions by 2050 and a phase out of coal power by 2040, marked a turning point in the country's sustainable development pathways. This cannot be done without a rigorous plan. The Prime Minister emphasized that the government sees the achievement of economic development and a better life for people of the country as consistent with this ambitious climate change agenda. So clearly, protecting vulnerable communities from the effects of climate change and preparing the young workforce for the jobs of the future have to remain top priorities if Vietnam is to achieve these combined goals. It is also clear that public investment, regulatory reform, and the development of new domestic financial instruments and institutions will be needed to transform the finance and governance context for this ambitious energy transition. It is true that Vietnam cannot do this alone. Its energy partnership with the industrialized world and its regional country partners is a potential source of support for some of these proposals. I hope that international partners recognize their commitments to share technology, expertise, and financial support to help Vietnam achieve this transition. To end, UNDP is working closely with the government and many of our partners on some of these proposals to align key national plans and strategies with the country's COP26 commitments. And we stand ready to support this country in this historic transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy that will be a demonstration to the world that the human and planetary well-being of people can be advanced while decarbonizing and leaving no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kani Wignaraja, with your keynote speech. And you have opened up some topics and solutions for finance for a just energy transition process. And now let's come to a presentation of Dr. Phạm Xuân Hoa, former chairman or director of the Banking Strategy Institute. So thank you very much. Bây giờ một điều rất quan trọng là chị cần nghe cái bức tên. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am very honored to be able to present my presentation on opportunities and challenges for green finance market development in Vietnam towards sustainable governance and development according to ESG practices. According to the keynote speech of Ms. Kani Wignaraja, as per the sharing just now, I would like to share about myself as well. I have 14 years of experience working alongside GIZ and Oxfam, looking into the concept of green bank and green finance instrument. And for more than 10 years already, I haven't seen much progress in this area. And still, well, we are just like a developing country in its energy pathway. Secondly, I joined Fair Finance Vietnam, and it is an initiative to evaluate credit institutions in Vietnam regarding whether they have been able to provide responsible lending and other criteria in this aspect. So we want to promote this. Another point to share with you, well, I'm retired already, and I'm the Secretary General of the Financial Lease Association of Vietnam. And recently, I worked with the Vietnam Garment and Textile Association in the green finance transition in the garment and textile sector of Vietnam in order to save energy, go forward to energy efficiency so that they can borrow from the better financing source. Otherwise, they may be subjected to carbon taxes and other instruments as the UN Assistant Secretary General mentioned just now. So many investors want to invest in Vietnam, but they need clean power. And if they cannot get green power, they will be subject to carbon taxes. And I would like to thank Ms. Ngọc to, shorten my presentation down to a version that I can deliver in 20 minutes. I will try my best to fulfill that goal. And, after COP26, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, including 450 firms representing 130 trillion US dollars of the world's financial assets, they reached 4 important agreements. The first one is to align operational and attributable emissions from their lending and investment portfolios with pathways to meet net zero by 2050 or sooner. So bear in mind that these are 450 firms holding a majority share of global assets. And within 18 months following joining, they need to set 2030 targets and 2050 targets, with intermediate targets to be set every 5 years from 2030 onwards. So they need to set out concrete targets when joining the alliance. Thirdly, the first 2030 targets will need to prioritize and focus on the most GHG intensive sectors, and especially in their investment and lending portfolios. and then there are going to be goals within 36 months of joining. And fourthly, on an annual basis, they will need to publish emissions reduction targets and results, and a board level review transition strategy, as well as climate-related sectoral policies. And none of the institution in Vietnam has joined. Đảm bảo cho chị là tiếng đủ to của các bạn Tây. Okay, so we will have a very big trend of green lending and investment. We did a lot of research in the banking sector, and our experience shows that there are two main trends. The first one is digitalization in the finance sector, and the second one is digital finance, including digital banking. The second trend is that we need to greenize the finance sector strongly, and that is the second trend. So green investment, green lending, relying on green bonds or green credit, etc., that will be on the rise, and there will be a high demand for green finance. These 450 major banks have already commercial representation in Vietnam. So we have a rather abundant supply of finance for Vietnam, and there are huge opportunities. The only thing is whether we can absorb this. The next item is green finance taxonomy and standards. We need to follow international practices. Now Monterey is drafting a decision on green taxonomy. Following that, we will evaluate, or investors will evaluate the relevant activities, and Editor Ming referred to decision 1658, but it is only limited to the initial draft version, and GSO will have a bigger role to play. And well, we also have quantitative targets, and also in here we need to think about how much to invest, how to reduce emission, how to protect the environment. Referring to the green standards, you can imagine that while tourism is a no emission industry, for example, we might think that it doesn't affect the environment, right? But no, actually the tourism industry may consume a lot of energy. For example, the tourism industry use a lot of detergent and other cleansing agents. And let's say if coastal hotels, the development of coastal hotels may lead to deforestation in this area, and that can be damaging to the environment. So there are a lot of counter arguments and while policies critiques, including those arguments. Another thing is that IFC, along with the SSC, they have come up with recommendations for the listed, nearly 800 listed companies for ESG standards adoption. ESG means environment, social, and governance, etc. So you know this already, right? And for internal governance, it can be gender equality, it can be gender pay gap, or worker welfare, or refraining from using forced labor or child labor, etc. So all of these should be included in governance. And Ms. Kani Wignaraja already mentioned this or touched upon this briefly in her 6 proposals. And also, according to ARENA's 2020 report on global renewables outlook to 2050, we will need 110 trillion of green financing, including about 27 trillion USD for renewables, or 3.2 trillion USD per year. How about Vietnam? According to the commitment made by PM Phạm Minh Chính and calculations made by academia, in order to enable energy transition in Vietnam and achieve the net zero commitment, well, we need a lot of funding, and domestically we can only provide 30%. The remaining 70% will need to be mobilized from the global market. If we don't provide good policies, it is very difficult to get that much funding. So COP26 can present important opportunities for developing countries. Well, developed countries need to make a commitment to contribute to GCF
a total of 100 billion USD. However, as of March 2021, I logged into the website of this GCF organization, and they have a total of only 10 billion. Another thing is that COP26 opens up huge opportunities for investment. And in his recent meeting between Mr. Alok Sharma and Minister of MOIT, there was a pledge to invest 130 billion USD in Vietnam through the Clean Climate Fund. And also, we may open up a new era of low carbon investment. And now people start realizing that investing in fossil fuel is quite risky. There is a concept of stranded assets as well. In 2020, for those who continue to invest heavily in fossil fuels, then Vietnam will have stranded assets to the value of 6.5 billion USD. And market mechanisms will help Vietnam to develop useful financial and monetary policies to attract public and private finance for sustainable development. Also, another thing is, globally, we may have 100 trillion USD that comes from liquidation of assets of companies that invest in fossil fuels. So with this, we can achieve less than 2% and reduce carbon emission by 80%. Let's now talk about the current status of green finance markets in Vietnam. Well, Vietnam made a very strong commitment, right? And in the keynote speech recently, Ms. Carney mentioned the commitments made by our PM Phạm Minh Chính at COP26 of net zero by 2050. So we have made even stronger commitments than China. China's timeline is 2060, but Vietnam it's 2050. So these are huge political commitments at the high level of Vietnam. Secondly, regarding ODA and public investment in infrastructure, in climate adapted infrastructure, etc., we have attracted a lot of this in the recent years. And also we have preferential import duties on renewable energy equipment, fit per schedule for renewables, and favorable corporate income tax as well. Also, we have extra budgetary financial funds for environmental protection that has been lent out to many projects, but it is a negligible amount. Also, we have issued green bond manual. Several commercial banks in Vietnam have issued green bonds to the value of 20 trillion, including from Vingroup. So recently they have invested in some environmental protection projects, some coastal projects as well. And we have about 35 trillion of bonds according to SSI statistics. Two cities in Vietnam have issued green bonds. Technically they are not called green bonds, but here it's the bonds to attract funding for environmental projects, including Ho Chi Minh City and Vũng Tàu. Another thing is that we have issued a corporate governance code of best practices on ESG for listed companies. Well, I think that in Vietnam, we don't lack any policy pillars. We have all three policy pillars. The first one, at the national level, we have a law on environmental protection. And in this law, there are important articles, Article 149 on green credit, and Article 150 on green bonds. And also we have Decision 1658 of the Prime Minister on the National Green Growth Strategy for period 2021 to 2030. So these are the key policies at the national level. We also have sectoral level policies, for example, for the banking industry. So now our draft circular on environmental risk management is being drafted. According to the environmental protection law, we have environmental risks, and later on when I talk about challenges, I will talk about the policy mindset of Vietnam. So green lending comes from the banks, and green bonds may come from the public sector, and the capital market can provide tax incentives. And we can also have green procurement. We are supposed to have green public procurement already, but I can confirm with you that there is no such thing called green public procurement in the Vietnamese system. Okay, so this is a story policy, and later on I will talk more about this in the recommendation section. Our third important pillar is the policies and procedures of credit institutions, green investment funds, or enterprises with green projects. These entities themselves, as mentioned by Ms. Kani Wignaraja before, they are two sides of the coin. On one side, we have green finance. On the other side, we should have governance. Both macro governance and micro governance at enterprise level, they should have that in place. And let's talk briefly about the banking sector. I am among the key persons of the scheme 1654 on green banks in Vietnam. Recently, SBV issued decision 1552 on action plan to support green economic development and others on green credit, etc. So a few others are being drafted, not issued yet. And we talk about stress testing, looking into the stress testing of the climate change response requirements on the lending portfolio of banks in Vietnam. So we have policy orientations in Vietnam, but these are not binding legal instruments yet. And these are the statistics on green credit growth for renewable energy and clean energy. And as of September 2021, we have a growth rate of 8.84% relative to 2020. This is one of our big questions as well. Well, after FITs has been removed and interconnected measures are not accepted by EVN, then the risks to renewable projects are very risky. And then they will become the non-performing loans, NPL, for the banks. So these statistics here are to be illustrative, and you can read more about them in a very detailed writing of mine that has been forwarded to the organizer. And let me now talk about their challenges. So in Vietnam, we always have a shortage of capital. As I mentioned before, we can meet only 30% of the required capital. 70% of the remaining capital will need to come from international organizations to meet the net zero ambition. Another thing is that in Vietnam, the interest rate, the cost of capital is very high compared to international sources. And most of the capital provided is on a short-term basis. I did a study on PDP 8. To be honest, in PDP 8, there are only 3 pages about finance for energy transition in PDP 8. Every year we need to spend 13 trillion USD. I did a lot of calculations, including depreciation by EVN, and though that payment ratio is 2.26%, but EVN can only provide 3.36 billion USD. The remaining amount will need to come from loans. Where does it borrow from? In PDP 8, we talk about the socialization of investment in renewable energy and green energy. So it is a big challenge for PDP 8. Between now and 2045, we need 13 billion USD. We don't have enough support policies for green credit. Ms. Kani Wignaraja mentioned green finance or green bonds, etc. They have to be at a sufficient level of liquidity and without interest or tax incentives, with no fee support and with no pricing policy, etc. It will be very difficult. The FIT schedule has to remain stable, right? It's not that you have FIT today but not tomorrow. If we have an auction, then let's have an auction on a quite stable period. So we need stability. Another thing is public green procurement, but it's not existent. And bear in mind that in GDP, government spending should be significant. If we can have green public procurement, then I believe that it's not just the banking sector, but other financial institutions and enterprises will all move toward sustainable green development. Another thing very important is the lack of awareness. on green consumption and other green items by Vietnamese consumers, because green products are often more pricey. So if they go to the supermarket and they see more expensive green items, they will not buy them. And in the keynote speech, Ms. Kani Wignaraja mentioned that she came here 20 years ago. Many things happened in the last 20 years, but not much has changed in our energy transition. I think the biggest issue with Vietnam is the lack of a consistent policy mindset. Well, mindset is important in order to ensure sufficient green finance for a just energy transition process. Also, there are three serious or severe risks. For example, there is the risk of stranded assets, or an NPL, as I mentioned before. And the financial and insurance funds as well, they will suffer from large compensation, and there will be risks in terms of asset price change. Now, given those challenges, let me now go to the policy recommendations to the government and the ministries, and then recommendations to the credit institutions. First, I think the government should very promptly issue the green list and also green statistics, etc. These will serve as standards to attract investment by investors and financial and credit institutions. And we need to have a baseline for green reporting, green statistics, and green investment, etc. Early on, I mentioned some statistics of the green industry, green sectors. Secondly, the government, SPV, and MOF should direct banks to develop green credit and green bonds programs for green and renewable energy. I want to go concretely into this. It has to be concrete rather than too broad. So we need to have a lending or a financing program for green energy transition. And next, government agencies should support and guide the private sector in accessing, mobilizing, and using international green finance, including international concessional finance. This is very important. The national focal point approving these programs and asking for funding from international organizations is MPI, but we don't have a unique or single coordinating agencies yet, so we need to have guidelines with the private sector for this. And regarding Vietnam's commitments at COP26, we need to coordinate state-owned corporations and private enterprises to develop commitments for transition of their investment and lending portfolios with pathways to net zero. We cannot just make announcement at the macro level. What's more important is the micro, lower level commitments, like banks and enterprises. They need to engage in a transition process as well. Next, we need consistent and stable policies to support the development of clean and sustainable green energy. It is very important, as I mentioned before. Now, recommendations to MOF, SPV, and MPI. These three ministries need to work alongside each other in order to be consistent in pricing, in tax support, in green spending, green public spending, etc. They are all very important. However, I think they have been at a very preliminary level, not to any depth yet. And then next, we need green public procurement, and they need to be incorporated into policies and implemented by ministries and provinces and local levels. Seventh, we need to leverage fiscal and monetary policy tools to attract green finance flows for green growth. For example, policies concerning tax fee, interest rate, fee schedule, or reserve requirement, refinancing, etc. So this is, let me quote an illustrative example. So Bangladesh, they have a 200 million green refinancing fund. We used to recommend to SBV when implementing Article 149 and 150 of the Environmental Protection Law to establish a similar mechanism to Bangladesh, but no response was provided. And eighth, the next recommendation is that SBV should provide guidance to local commercial banks to develop and implement an ESG-based governance strategy. And ninth, SBV should agree with MOF to increase private finance in foreign debt structure for more green capital inflows in Vietnam's green energy transition. While if we don't prioritize green capital inflows, then we may lead to an ask-give mechanism that is overly stringent on the private sector. And 10th, we need to develop a sustainable development strategy as part of the development strategy for the banking sector. And 11th, banks should issue regulations or policies to encourage businesses and individuals to receive their loans or investments to comply with the ESG standards for all products and services. The 12th recommendation is to disclose environmental and socially responsible lending policies, provide updated information for convenient inquiry and verification of policies and actions on their websites. 13th recommendation, consultation with local communities and social organizations when financing large energy projects with severe environmental and social impacts. So international financial institutions have been extremely transparent. We have HSBC and Standard Chartered. We have Miss Michelle Wee here. And then number 14, we should take immediate actions in the field that we are financing. I think for financial institutions, credit institutions, based on these orientations, they should step up their internal control. And I've got a very detailed work in the field of ESG. Finally, this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. So please accept my sincere apologies. Thank you very much.
Xin cảm ơn phần chia sẻ của tiến sĩ Phạm Xuân Hòe với những nội dung về thực trạng của chính sách tài chính cho dịch chuyển năng lượng tại Việt Nam, cũng như những đề xuất, những khuyến nghị chúng tôi cho rằng là cũng hết sức
energy transition process in Vietnam. And now let's look out to international experience. We do know that certain countries have developed green banks for public development projects, and now we will have a presentation from two professors from the University of London. So Professor Ulrich Wolfs and Professor Thomas Maras from the University of London delivering their presentation through Zoom. Gentlemen, I would appreciate if you can speak closer to the mic.
I'm going to share my screen here. One moment, please. Are you able to see my presentation? I can. Good. Okay. Wonderful. First of all, just thank you to the organizer, to UNDP for this wonderful invitation and a chance to share some ideas with you on financing energy transitions. Sorry, just make sure. You can't see the presentation. It shows it sharing on my screen. Sorry, the presentation. If the organizers can confirm. cities project. But we've also recently done research on the role of Ilan in terms of water provisioning. And the argument there, the research has shown that it's a lead in financing sustainable water in the country because no one can compete with the low rates and terms of financing that the bank provides, which is exactly the kind of project and terms of financing that we want. My favorite example I'd like to speak to, and this is an example of where the Global South provides a strong governance model to the Global North, is the Banco Popular Costa Rica, which is an example of a bank that is enabling both green and just transitions through co-creation, meaning that it's integrating the needs and aspirations of society in the governance and the actual running of the bank. They have a large governing council that then gives the overall mandate and direction to the bank itself. So one example that I think I find inspirational is we have a cooperative energy provider called Coopalesca in the center of Costa Rica that provides a significant, maybe about at least 10 or 15% of the energy needs for the country. That recognized that the water sources in this region were becoming polluted. So it went to the local public bank, the Banco Popular, and they together developed a series of loans around decarbonizing. The energy provider is building and so on, but also developing a partnership around protecting the water sources, which included hydroelectric power sources in the region, and started to develop a partnership to repurchase land around the water sources and then allow them to rewild, from which they then developed a further partnership with the local university to have a better understanding of sustainability in the region, how to rewild areas, how to protect water sources, and how to do so as you were generating low carbon energy. This bank also has a specific mandate that all major decisions have gender equity on it. So all of its governance bodies have minimum 50% women and 50% men. So it is an important example of how you can marry finance and green energy transition in a public institution. Uli, I will now pass it over to you and just let me know if you want to go on to the next slide.
Yeah, thank you, Tom, and good afternoon, everyone. Great pleasure to be part of this event. It's been really fascinating discussion so far, and we really have to have not only this discussion but also move forward with ramping up finance for just energy transition. And as I think Tom already has made a strong case that public development banks can really play an important role in that. Next slide, please. So I'd like to re-emphasize that while of course we do need the private financial sector to really play its part, that there are some important limitations, specifically also when it comes to issues around climate finance. And so we need a lot of long-term finance, which is in short supply from the private financial sector, especially also when it comes to smaller and newer innovative companies. These face great obstacles in obtaining finance. I'll talk about that in a moment a bit more deeply, and also a lot of the financing activity involving great news is that renewable energy are the cheapest form of energy. So economically, we have no way so on to invest in coal or any fossil energy anymore because the green energy are indeed also the cheaper. So even if you don't care about climate change, which we all should do very much, but even if you don't care about environmental impact, the economics are very much in favor now of renewable energy. But the big obstacle is the high upfront investment, and this is a particularly large problem in countries like Vietnam. So empirically it's clear that developing countries have to pay higher cost of capital anyway, but this problem is actually also worsened by climate change. So in 2018 we did an empirical study and published a major report with UNEP where we showed for the first time that climate change is driving up cost of capital, and there were follow-up studies by us, but also by the International Monetary Fund, which have confirmed it. And we've also shown that this translates to higher cost of capital for corporations. And that is a big obstacle to just transition and also more broadly. And it provides a strong rationale for having public banks, public finances that step in and try to reduce the cost of capital problem. And public development banks, with their backed by states, but also national entities, can really make an important difference. Next slide. And very importantly, public development banks can leverage private capital. And there has been a lot of discussion, of course, about how can we channel private capital both from international sources but also from private domestic sources into the energy transition. And the reality is that unfortunately, to date, the track record of leveraging private capital has not been very good with project-based blended finance approaches. And I'm not saying that project-based blended finance approaches per se are not working, but they have not worked in leveraging capital to the amounts that are needed. But we do have a very well-functioning and tried and tested approach to leveraging private capital through public development banks. So, and that applies both to multilateral development banks, but also to national development banks. And so that is an important way of bringing in private capital both from domestic sources and international sources. For example, public development banks can issue bonds, could be green bonds, sustainability linked bonds, and basically collect private capital and then really channel it in much more efficient ways into relevant areas than through project-based blended finance. Next slide, please. And very importantly, public development banks in their operations can really put a focus on socio-economic outcomes. And so it's not just the financial viability of the project, which of course also public development banks have to make sure is achieved, but also the positive externalities. And so it's not just the returns that are driving investment. They need to work profitably to be viable, but they have a much broader mandate. And specifically when it comes to just transition financing, a lot of projects generate enormous benefits, but kind of from a purely private finance perspective, they may not get realized. So taking a broader perspective on economic financial viability and broader socioeconomic outcomes is something where public development banks can really add a very important value. Next slide. And this is indeed bringing me to the end of the presentation. As was emphasized, Vietnam has made important pledges, and this is very commendable. But I think it's also, and it has been highlighted, very clear that there needs to be an ambitious strategy to really translating that into practice. And having a specialized financial institution that really can focus on the key areas, that has the expertise to really assess the viability of specific energy transition related projects, that is able to refinance itself cheaply and pass on the cheaper financing cost, that can make a real difference. So very glad that we can have with you the discussion around the role of public development banks. And there are a lot of important lessons to be learned internationally. Of course, in our presentation, we've just skimmed, touched on that. We have to go much deeper, but we look forward to working with all of you on advancing the just transition. Thank you.
Vâng, chúng ta vừa nghe những chia sẻ của giáo sư Ulrich và tiến sĩ Thomas với những kinh nghiệm của quốc tế cũng như một số bài học gợi mở cho Việt Nam. Và chúng ta sẽ nhanh chóng chuyển sang một trong những nội dung tiếp theo quan trọng của ngày hôm nay. Xin mời bộ phận kỹ thuật hỗ trợ chúng tôi triển khai bản sân khấu. Kính thưa quý vị, chúng ta sẽ
arrange chairs and tables for the panel discussion, and we will now have a panel discussion among the speakers and other guests on the situation in Vietnam and policies for the just energy transition. We are going to have the following panelists. We are going to have Mr. John Rockford, Pacific Rim Investment and Management, Ms. Michelle Wee, CEO Standard Chartered Bank Vietnam, Ms. Phạm Nguyễn Ngọc Thương, Deputy CEO, CFO of BCG Energy Joint Stock Company, and Ms. Diana Barrow-Clow, UNCTAD, Mr. Bùi Trung Kiên, Vice Chairman, CME Solar, Mr. Lê Trọng Minh, Editor-in-Chief, Vietnam Investment Review, and the moderator for this panel is Ms. Đỗ Lê Thu Ngọc, UNDP, Inclusive Growth Unit Head. So we'd like to invite all of the named guests to come up to the stage, please.
Kính thưa quý vị, chúng ta đang theo dõi nội dung này thông qua các kênh trực tuyến.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are following, for those who are following us through the website of UNDP and Vietnam Investment Review website. Well, please enjoy a virtual tea break. And for those joining here with us, well, please get your tea and coffee here. We have refreshments served outside, and we will not break for tea or coffee. And we hope you can serve yourself on that and remain with us. Thank you very much. Ở đây thì rẻ, ở đây thì nghe được.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much to our panelists for agreeing to come again on a very late Friday afternoon and to such an important topic. So again, I'd like to thank Ms. Michelle Wee, CEO of Standard Chartered Bank, Mr. John Rockhold from Pacific Rim Investment, Ms. Thương Phạn from BCG Energy, and Mr. Bùi Trung Kiên from CME Solar. So thank you very much for joining us. And in the interest of time, I'm sorry, we are going to press on with the panel discussion. And I hope we have Diana, who's joining us.
Yes, I'm here.
Hello, Diane from Geneva. Thank
Hello,
you
good
very much.
afternoon.
And then I would ask permission to moderate in English, since a lot of our panelists are non-Vietnamese speakers. Thank you very much. So I suppose the first question, we have listened to Mr. Hue and also Tom and Uli on the policy implication, and also on the one of the tools, more in-depth dive into the tool of the Public Development Bank. But I would like to again hear from the perspective of the private sector companies, represented by John, by Mr. Huong, Mr. Kian, for example. Maybe perhaps the first question to ask you is, what do you see as the main opportunities and the constraint to private investors in the renewable energy sector in Vietnam? So perhaps I'll ask Ms. Thuong to start first, ladies first.
Thank you for the questions. So I represent BCG Energy to come here. So we invested in all of the renewable energy with both solar and wind and rooftop solar in Vietnam. So we've been in the market for the last 5 years in the market. And of course, it's my pleasure to be here. And regarding to the questions about the opportunities, also the constraints and the obstacle that we are facing recently while doing renewable energy in Vietnam. So we saw, as a private sector, we saw a lot of opportunities in Vietnam, since we know that with the guidance and also the high-level instruction from the government office toward to the COP26 with the net zero. Of course, for the private sector, we want to, together with all of other sectors, to be able to achieve that. Of course, with the opportunity, we know that Vietnam is lacking electricity and have more opportunity for us in all other different fields as well. But the main obstacle and constraint for us to develop the energy in Vietnam is first is regarding to the policy, the legal framework in Vietnam regarding to those. Second is regarding to how we going to finance with this current legal framework, and also with the current policy. When we know that we have been developing and have around 540 megawatt in operations at the moment, and continue to have more in the futures. And what we are facing right now is we're facing with more than 20 months for the solar farm doesn't have any pricing at the moment. And with more than 10 months for the wind that doesn't have a pricing at the moment. So of course it's a challenge. There are opportunities, but there's a lot of challenge for us to actually use our own equity and try to work with all other international financier and different finance institutions in the world, including for local financing to service that. Yeah, so mainly just policy and finance.
Thank you. John, would you mind commenting on?
Yeah, I totally agree, but I'll go right to the other areas. We need a strong, bankable electricity Vietnam. And electricity Vietnam, they need a roadmap. So people see where the energy prices are going to go for the next future. When people see that, when industries see that, when people see that, people will start to invest in energy efficiency. Investors will see that there's going to be a strong Vietnam or electricity Vietnam. We get very worried when we see that electricity Vietnam has to take on subsidies. They can't operate if they have to foot the bill for subsidies, and we really don't see the need anymore for subsidies when we talk about renewable energy. Solar prices, as our speakers are saying, are very reasonable.
offshore wind. I've just seen some great feasibility studies by big companies at 5.2 cents. This is onshore. And offshore wind is a bit more of a challenge. Next one of our big challenge is how do we develop the Vietnamese private sector? We need them to work with us and to be part of the whole transition. There's very few private Vietnamese companies inside the power and energy sector. This has always been operated by state-owned. And what you need here is it's very difficult for them to get through the what we call the banking professional due diligence. We had one company that we worked with. It took us 7 months to get them approved by IFC. And at the end of the day, it's basically we had to go to the bank and take three years of their records to show where their money was going and where they took it from and where they come from. We also need the Vietnamese banks to be able to access this money and also get through the due diligence. They're also needing to do these things. And it's difficult. And then we need capacity building at national level, at provincial levels. We need to see our universities and our trade schools start to develop the new sectors that we need. So there's a lot of work to do to get basically the $100 billion we need from the private sector here to Vietnam.
Thank you, John. Mr. Kian, as a representative from a domestic energy company, what were your views of what John and Mr. Hung say? And then, in terms of additional policy change or anything, what policy or procedures would help your company expand your business?
Good afternoon. I'm representing CME, and I'm very glad to participate in this roundtable workshop. And I think that we touch on very important transitions of the energies in the world and in Vietnam. However, we think that this is a very beginning of the transitions and applying the renewable energy in Vietnam economy. So as an investor, we once we invest in this area, we based on our assessment important foundation of the policies, where we see the strong commitment from the government, started with decision number 11, followed by decision number 13, encouraging the investment in the solar energy. We see the commitment from the government through COP26 that we think that there's a strong transitions in the economy toward renewable energy. And I think it's the first step. This is the first step. And the second step is implementation. So for the long-term investment, we need the stable and consistent policy, and as well as the foreseeable policy in the long term, so that we can have confidence for long-term investment, as well as we can gradually improve our competitiveness to build our to increase our strength in the market. However, we see that some obstacle that we see the gap of the policy and the delay of the policy in the level of instruction as well as the guideline to implement the renewable project. So I think it's currently the most obstacle that we are facing.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Kian. Michelle, I'd like to maybe go from a finance provider perspective. Mr. Hue, for example, said that in providing upfront finance is a challenge for a lot of these, especially a lot of these projects are slow, in the coming and also capital intensive. So, what is Standard Chartered's sort of experience in arranging finance for Vietnam. Do you see the same issues that John mentioned about companies not passing their due diligence, for example?
Thank you. So good afternoon, everybody. As I was listening through the presentations, I was getting increasingly stressed because finance was mentioned so often as like the one to make it all happen in Vietnam. I think that's good and bad. But I also was comforted when Ms. Carney said profitability, predictability, and bankable. So at least somebody understands how banks operate. I think that's the first principle. We are commercial, right? We are a commercial and we are not Red Cross. That's the first point I'll make. However, it doesn't mean that we will not bend over backwards to do a sustainable trade because of the importance globally and also locally. So as an institution, Standard Chartered Bank has made commitments to be net zero as an institution by 2030 and our balance sheet by 2050. So we started this journey years ago. Today, we have frameworks for ESG financing, sustainable financing, renewables financing, transition financing, which we released last year, that is so granular on the segments, on the clients, on the amount that we're going to reduce. It's granular. So imagine an institution like us. The last step now is to get these ESG frameworks into a risk metric. And this is the principal risk types that we are talking about. And we have governance around all this, and it's auditable, it's transparent, we publish it, we are responsible. Now you lift this, and the reason why I'm saying this is you lift this out of an institution like Standard Chartered and you throw it at Vietnam. I call that aspirational. The 2050 commitments was fantastic for us. I can tell you from a Standard Chartered's perspective, the conversations that we've had with clients has been night and day since November when this announcement was made. So it's extremely encouraging. Now, is it at the momentum where it should be? The answer is it's not there yet. It's only relevant to the biggest of all corporations, and we haven't even got to the depth of it. So I frame it in three very simple things. Aspiration, we have it. Now it's inspiration. How do we inspire everybody to come on this journey? So we need help. Banks are not going to be able to do it by ourselves. So what we have committed to is 300 billion. I have 300 billion. Standard Chartered is willing to finance 300 billion of financing. Yes, green financing. At COP26 last year, I have committed as an MOU, we signed it with 3 large corporations, 8.5 billion. I am desperately working through this 8.5 billion to deliver. And we have made progress. Is it fast enough? No, but there are significant challenges. So we will work through them and we will have something to report to the Prime Minister and hopefully at COP27, where we are delivering some of these commitments. So inspiration is not just about doing the deal. It's not just about the asset. It's also about the education of the market. So we all do the work that we need to do for conferences such as this, super important. We're all talking about why it's necessary and we all get it. But are we necessarily moving in the right direction together? I'm not so sure. But I do have comfort that on the national level, as a national agenda, all ministries are talking about this all the time. This is an obsessive topic. It is thematic. So for example, as chairperson of the Banking Working Group now, we are hosting together with the State Bank of Vietnam a conference on releasing finance. Probably most of you, if not all of you, will be invited to that event so that you can hear from the State Bank and the Banking Working Group, which is represented by all foreign banks, on how do we unleash this finance. And the conversations that I've been having with the State Bank is not just about the asset, it's about the balance sheet. It is everything from the deposits to trade finance, sustainable trade finance. And so transition financing is another portion that we don't even talk about. So we need to inspire. And then lastly, we need to execute. So all of us have We know there are significant challenges. We need help. We need a framework that is transparent, consistent, global, right? If you don't have global frameworks, then what you're saying is to the global investors, we are a little bit different. You have to do a completely different set of due diligence. You have to come in and understand, the frameworks much more granularly, and then you can make your decisions on whether you want to partake in this market. We're saying, let us just shortcut all of it because there are enough expertise globally to be able to come and share thought leadership, to tell you what good looks like, what are the frameworks in place, even the carbon markets that Monterey is trying to set up by 2025. There are working models, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Singapore. These are just some of the examples that I can give. So let me stop here.
Thank you very much. I think the room sort of woke up when you say you do actually have the money.
The bankability of the PPA, right? Significant challenges. Okay.
I think that is definitely, and so the direct purchase power agreement has to be bankable in order for the commercial banks to, for companies to use that for credit. So that's great. Diana, I'm aware that you've been following us online, but haven't had a chance to speak. I hope that, you could see us in the room. You might not be able to see.
Yes, I can see you.
But just kind of asking you to comment a little bit on, some of the national banks in the regions. For example, the national development banks in the region have failed to live up to the expectations. So what were the reasons for this? I mean, Uli and Thomas essentially talk about the pros of the public development banks. What were the reasons for some of these probably that did not work, and what steps could be taken to ensure that these banks have a positive impact on the supply of long-term financing?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Super. Well, yes, thank you. As you say, I have been sitting here listening, but it's been fascinating. So I'm very happy to have been part of this process. I'm learning a lot and it's been very interesting. Thank you. If I can just address the point from the previous speakers as well. What I think what we've heard in the room is that there is money available. And that's a very important message. We heard that also from the investment speakers at the beginning of the presentation and from the speakers now. But having money available is not the same thing as meaning that the funds will go to those very difficult activities that sometimes, with a transition of this nature, it requires a huge amount of upfront capital, and it might be quite a long time before there is a profit to be made. So the social and economic benefit may be there quite quickly, but the financial rewards take a lot longer. And this is one of the great challenges of this transition ahead of us. And I think that we should not underestimate the importance of what we're trying to do here. In all the broad sweeps of history, when we made these massive changes, it's like the change out of subsistence agriculture into industry. And now we're looking at going from industry into a green industry, a green energy. This is really huge, and it's not going to be possible to do it without a really committed public partner, and in fact, I'm going to say a leader in all of this process. So let's just think about, why are we suddenly talking about public banks now? Well, I'm going to say, first of all, that it's not sudden. Public banks have been at the heart of all the major transitions historically. Now, as you mentioned, it's a kind of a fashion too, isn't it? We see the pendulum swing. And I think if you look at the history of public banking, you can really see three waves occurring. That first wave starts from the Bretton Woods inception of the major public banks, the global ones. And then there's a second wave that starts really in the 1980s, where there's still a lot of other new banks emerging and old banks are still maintaining their position. But there's really a sense that these banks are disappointing and that they're not providing the service that was required. And that's a strong feeling that comes from, I would say, the lack of faith in the public sector altogether, not only public banks, but also everything associated with the state. And yes, there are cases where public banks in that period particularly. They lent to projects that were maybe politically motivated rather than being really economic or socially important. Things were not always monitored correctly. Of course, corruption is something that can't be ignored. But I think what is very important is, we have to ask these same questions about private banking as well. And I think that we have been holding banks to different standards. What we see from the 1990s onwards is this third wave of a great reappraisal of the role of the public banks, and partly because of thinking about different ways to more democratically govern them so that we observe better their performance and we can monitor more and ensure that banks really are performing as they were expected in terms of financial program, but also in terms of the kind of lending that they do. And there's a lot of lessons that we learn here from the Asian industrial miracle, in fact, from the reciprocal control mechanisms that were used through all of those fast industrializers. And we're doing this now in the great push that is going ahead at this time, where we need to have monitoring of what banks are doing, but also a roadmap and a plan. So I'm very glad that the previous speakers mentioned that, because the existence of money is not enough. There also needs to be a plan for its use. And perhaps if I could also just say very briefly, we were talking about, what are the potentials for public partnerships with private mechanisms. And we see, for example, the green bonds market, which is $1 trillion and more and growing. And I'm sure that there are high hopes for the green bond market here as elsewhere. But what we discovered in Geneva, we did an analysis of a huge number of green bonds, and we found that actually none of them had a contingent requirement that the bond performed in the sense of the impact that had been at the heart of the design of the bond. So this was not evaluated correctly on performance. Now, so you asked me earlier, how do we explain the fact that some public banks had a poor record in the past? Well, let's look at the record of the green bonds currently. We hope that they can be an important source of effective finance, but we still have a lot of work to do to make sure that they really are living up to their potential. So I'll leave it now. I know we have a lot of speakers and not much time.
Thank you very much. It's a bit sobering for us all that the green bonds has hope, but also comes with a lot of risk as well. I mean, we could sit here and talk about green bonds all day, and we will not get to the bottom of it. If I could perhaps move on a little bit more to discuss sort of the aspect from the Vietnamese companies and that are operating in the energy and renewable energy sector. So, John, perhaps if you could elaborate a little bit more. You did say before about how the companies are unable to access long-term finance because they don't pass the due diligence process, for example. So, in terms of the apart from the financial capability, do they have the sort of the scale and the technological capacities to compete in this sector with the foreign companies?
No, that's important. One, international companies are too expensive to come here and build energy. They have to team up with Vietnamese companies. That's it. Now, the whole thing, how do we bring these Vietnamese companies into the fold with us that they can pass this international due diligence? Because the banks, I can tell you, they bring in their lawyers, they bring in their engineers, and they do a very thorough investigation. Is this technology sustainable? Will it deliver what it's supposed to deliver? What type of guarantees are you giving us? Do you have a government guarantee? Is the PPA there? Is it going to face any curtailments? It's possible, but I think it is going to take us. It's going to take us 10 years to do this. It's not something that we can get build up a private sector here. But if we look back to Vietnam, I mean, when I came here in '92, we had very few private sectors in the water and sanitation sector. Today, almost all water supplies are built by the Vietnamese private sector. There's very little is done by government. And this goes into the road, bridges, and things like this now. So Vietnam technical capabilities go very quickly. It is how we get them qualified at the very beginning. And how do we really transition? Is it right to put all this burden on Vietnam to go green right away? We need to get we have 17 gigawatts we built. We can't get it into the grid. Why? Because our grid, our mix is not there. We need base load. We need so you can't put the financial burden on Vietnam to leapfrog. Vietnam will have to transition. And it's just I think 3 days ago, we saw the government go in, make commitments to cut more coal, but they're going for gas and hydrogen. Now, hydrogen is something in the future, but yes, I agree with them. Make the gas industry build for hydrogen now, if they're going to invest in that. Also, we also see green. We see solar working here. We see solar, except a lot of our companies have got curtailment. So that's also putting a lot of pressure to international investors. If you look at this 17 gigawatt, very little was financed at all from the international sector, except for some loans from China based on equipment. You use our equipment, we give you, we give you money. But also Vietnam, when we look at climate change, Vietnam is also looking at this climate change. How is climate change affecting wind and solar? In Europe last year, we saw all the predictions very high to produce a lot of electricity from wind, but the wind did not perform. So we had to jump back. Now, a country like Vietnam doesn't have the financial capabilities to just all of a sudden go back and turn on the gas or the coal that they shut down in the past. So Vietnam has to be very careful to protect their economic development. When we talk about green bonds, it looked really good to make a drive for the industries here and industrial parks to start thinking green. But what happened just a few weeks ago? Now we see that gas is green, according to Europe. So and nuclear. So it's, a lot of us go, oh, but yeah, this is really good. And then all of a sudden, whoa, how we're doing. So it's a lot of challenge. I think we have the PDP-8. I think it's there. And what we're saying from the private sector, now I speak like from the Vietnam Business Forum and Bureau, that put it out there, because what is going to be built is where the private sector is going to invest in. It's not going to be some list here and here. It's going to be what the world will finance and what they will build. And that's what we saw in PDP-7 also. They had a lot of coal there, but we ended up and only 850 megawatts of renewable. And what happened? We didn't see that much coal, but we saw 17 gigawatts of renewable. So that follow the money.
Ms. Thuong, perhaps if you would like to add anything on, because I know BCG has got a series of solar farms and wind and a lot of, but you obviously come with your own financing. So in terms of the the challenges that John or Michelle raised, in your experience with BCG, has that been an issue, or are there other things that we haven't discussed?
Yeah, obviously. So we actually been raising fund locally in the past couple of years for our projects, and of course there are been back then we have, but of course it will be a little bit different on the requirement of the local banks in Vietnam, a completely different requirement from the international financier. So let's take an example, like when John mentions about the due diligence process that we might possibly fail in between, and how are we as a local developer try to, accomplish, especially for the ESG standard, and especially how are we going to govern and structure ourselves to be able to achieve the, and meet the international standard and have the green fund or green bond from different financier, right? So we've been using local bank and having supportive from local bank in the past 3-4 years to build our assets up till now. But of course, we know that there are too many obstacles and different, changes in policy from state banks and from SEC, and also from the government and MOIT itself, that some of the policy have changed, and that and all of these policy change for our local developer, we take a look at, would that fair to a local developer to actually achieve and actually motivate ourselves toward to the change to achieve that, right? While we have been discussing for PPA, whether it's bankability, how the PPA going to be bankable. With the curtailment, let's say, for example, when we are facing for the curtailment risk, what things that is just a temporary issue during the TED holiday or COVID situation, COVID time, but there's nothing being structured under the PPA to protect the developer, right? So that is one of the obvious issues and obvious points that been keep raising and questioning from different financier. So we are trying to complete ourselves and innovate ourselves and being inspired with different and with the guidance of government to achieve whatever that we want to achieve, right? But of course, we need the government, the MOIT, EVN, different authority to help us to build the strong, like a strong basement for us, like a backbone for us to move forward. And we, with the current local financing, that we will know that not just green bond or green fund that are very popular right now, and they are trying to disperse the fund into Vietnam. We will try to get all of the projects to be refined, let's say, for example. And where is the policy for refinancing for us as a local developer? Try to get, and from the current, previous presentation, we see that Vietnam will not be able to finance and service that large amount of capital in the next 10 years or 20 years. Then how are we going to change that? And that is also a keep coming question for us as a local developer as well. Where do we start? Or all of the authority, all of the department, government officer has to start to do something, right?
So just also, I think from what you, John, and Ms. Tung said, I mean, there's obviously a degree of public investment that's required up front, in order to facilitate the sort of improve the modernization of the grid, for example, so that the curtailment can cease. So there, Diana, would you care to sort of comment on this?
Yes, just repeat the question. Sorry, I didn't hear you very clearly.
Sorry, so just linking public investment in public finance to industrial policy, to modernization of the grid, for example. So investing in certain upfront infrastructure to facilitate the private businesses.
Yes, I think several speakers have mentioned that. In fact, John, you made that point just now, but also some of the speakers before you talking about the need for the private sector, who, we want private sector as a valuable partner. They need to have consistent and sort of a clear view of what might be in the future. Obviously not 100%, because they're entrepreneurs. They are supposed to take some risk, but they do actually need to have some confidence that the road will be reasonably as it appears. And so for this to happen, there needs to be a stable and consistent policy direction, articulated by government, and that may involve all the ministries, not just one. It might also involve, for example, industry, textiles industry, who is, for example, Vietnam has a textile industry that uses a lot of fossil fuel-based products. Synthetic textiles are about to be hit by new trade policies against plastic. And at the same time, you're wanting to have energy which is going to fulfill requirements of international markets, that it's green. This is all coming. So the idea that that one can't respond, that's gone. I mean, those old paths of development that countries successfully used in the past, even the recent past, those paths can no longer be followed. So, now that we need a new path, we definitely need an industrial policy and complementary policies to maintain that. That is going to be at the level of trade and industry and electricity. All of these things come together. And this is what I was referring to when I said that at all the other stages in history where countries have successfully launched on a completely different new path, this is how they did it. And I think the exciting thing is, and the encouraging thing is, that countries have done this before. And in fact, particularly from this region, the Asian region affords us many really encouraging examples of how to do it. I think one thing that is maybe interesting to think about is the way that the world responded to the COVID shock. Because when we talk about climate change shocks, we are tending to talk often about a kind of a slow burn. But what we saw with COVID was a really fast burn, where countries responded incredibly quickly, and they did make plans, often on the hoof, sometimes changing plans very, very quickly. But at the center of every single country's plan was the role of banks. And they used commercial banks often, but they really relied on public banks. And the public banks both created the credit and they guided it hand in hand with a health policy and an employment policy and an industrial policy that made this kind of articulated. And in fact, Thomas and I and many other colleagues around the world, we did a lot of research on this, and we interviewed a huge number of banks. And one of the things that really struck me when I was talking to particularly the multilateral development banks and the regional banks is that they want to lend. And that's one of the things to think about when one's on the other side, being a borrower, as maybe many of the people in the room are anticipating being borrowers for this side of the transition, is that these big banks, they really, really want to lend to you. And so you need to have a partner on the other side to deal with these big banks. And so a strong national public bank will also be your partner with these big public banks who want to lend, because that is their raison d'etre. And enabled to do that effectively, we need an industrial policy and a roadmap and a plan. So it does all come together it's a very complex, integrated approach that is needed. But as I said, we can learn from history because it's been done before. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Diana. So just maybe turning back down to the panelists in the room, Diana has talked about the role of public banks. Perhaps Mr. Kian, if as an investor in renewable, with CME, in your view, how can domestic banks further, help finance long-term renewable projects?
So we already invest in the solar farm and also in the rooftop solar. And in the past, when the feed-in tariff policy is available, we see that domestic bank, some domestic banks are very active. They are very positive. And sorry, that to say, foreign banks, they are very hesitant. Maybe the concern of the PPI and so. And however, after feed-in tariff is end, so we don't find any clear structures of the pricings to buy the electricity from renewable energies. And I agree with the point that this is a very big obstacle We understand the concern of the financial institution about the no guarantee of the turnover in the future. And in our models, currently we focus on the rooftop solar, where we invest and install and operate the rooftop solar and sell directly to the factory. So our returns based on the payment from our partner, the factories. And we cooperate with some impact fund, environment fund, and they check with technical DD, financial DD, legal DDs. And I share the view that we need to improve our ability to approach the internet standard, especially in ESG, so that we can attract the attention and also can mobilize from the foreign impact fund. And in terms of the domestic banks, we see that the requirement of very huge sort of financing. Mr. Wei just said that it's about 13 billion US dollar annually from now on up to 2030. And in terms of renewable energy, we think that we need at least around 4 billion annually. And means of, besides the foreign source, the main of the financial support is from the domestic commercial bank. We see that the long-term investment in Vietnam is still based on the sort of the commercial bank, and especially is a long-term financial fund. So it's very it's difficult for commercial bank to mobilize, and the limitation to convert from the short-term mobilization into the long-term investment. So I think the commercial bank in Vietnam, the domestic banks still play very important role in mobilizing the source for the renewable energy with their mobilization, as well as they play the role as the agency to mobilize the foreign investment from foreign institution, financial institution, as well as a foreign fund, so that the foreign bank can base on the assessment of the domestic bank on the qualification of the borrower. So I think it's maybe the way that to improve the ability and the credibility of the borrower in the eye of the foreign fund and foreign financial institutions.
Thank you very much.
Let me just say one real quick. I think you hit a very strong point there, and I think we're not seeing that because it's not reported a lot. This rooftop solar, where we're seeing direct power purchase agreements between companies like this and the international industries. International industries during the peak period of the day are paying around 12 cents. These type of companies now are offering deals of 3 cents over the lifetime. Of course, these companies are going to jump at that, and I think even banks like this, when you have a big private sector, they're going to look at this and say, wow, you got an agreement between let's just say Intel, and they're going to buy this energy for the next 15 years, and then it's free to them. It's a market to really watch now, because they're not selling it into the grid. They're just lowering their peak rates during the day.
May I add to your point that in our estimations, there potential of around 40 gigawatt of the solar energy in Vietnam with the available space of rooftop in the industrial zone, and the factory can get the benefit with the lower price, the discounted price, as compared to what they have to buy from EVN. So it's no burden on the transmission, where the energy is directly to the factory.
Michelle, would you want to say that? Yeah. So just to maybe follow up on your, on Mr. Kian and John's point before, in terms of the the domestic bank comments. And in your Standard Chartered's experience of sort of providing finance, do you have the same issues with the kind of the domestic firms not being able to pass the due diligence and so on, in terms of providing, sort of long-term finance?
Yes. I think we have very clear frameworks that are global. And so when we come into discussions with local corporates, the challenges are material because they have to adhere to the frameworks before something can be deemed green. Now, I think what I mentioned earlier about helping the transition is very important. So we have something called advisory as well, where we take up the responsibility to be advisors to the local corporate. If they want to get green financing, they will have to go through these structures. Now, usually, to find a company that is so committed to this transition financing, I think it's more and more, but it's still not enough. And it is expensive. And so when you come down to bottom line and you're talking about commerciality, I think that buy side, sell side, they have to come to a happy medium where there is the willingness on both sides, and really do the pain of transition. That's where that is reality. Now, few and far between, and we can still find the client that wants to go through this. Now, the question is, how do we get more people believing in this agenda? As I said, the inspiration to want to go through this. Now, any incentives on whether it's a tax incentive or whether it's a framework from the government, it's a guideline you must do, I don't know what it is, we're all ideating, that would help. I think that would help to escalate the process. Right now, it's all private sector. You go and do it. I want to achieve by 2050 net zero, and go do it. It's like, okay, let's do it. So that's where we are, right?
I mean, this is why we're having this conversation about, the governance factors that could essentially facilitate and enable the private companies to invest more easily or to attract investment more easily.
We hit a very important point. Most of the big corporations internationally, who are the FDIs at the backbone of FDI in Vietnam right now, they're having to reach net zero a lot quicker. And what they're looking at is countries that give them the green energy and the green fuel to reach that net zero. So it's important for Vietnam to meet that obligation. Yeah.
Yes, and to that point, Vietnam has a very ambitious target to grow exports year on year, right, by 5 to 6% up to 2030. And right, if you, and especially now, as Vietnam wants also ambitiously to be international trade and global supply chain provider and China plus one strategy, it is very important to make sure that they get this right, because this is a key feeder. In fact, ESG is a feeder to be able to increase your export to the Western countries where the rules and regulations are so much stricter and getting even worse. So this is a forward-looking trajectory. I mean, there is no, it is critical. It is necessary, right? And I think the government understands that. How do we get there together?
I'd like to perhaps invite any questions from the audience. So I think we have about 10 minutes more only. So if anybody would like to ask any of the panelists questions, please raise your hands, and then perhaps we can pass the mic down to mời anh Huệ.
Hello. Tôi có một cái câu hỏi. Từ nãy giờ thì có nghe một cái câu chuyện là
I have
cái ngân
one
hàng công.
question. So
Để-
I have been hearing from you regarding the role of public banks, public development banks, in green financing and achieving net zero by 2050. But there is one thing that is very important, and if we are not careful enough, there will be an issue of confusion. We have 4 state-owned commercial banks. They are state-owned banks, but they are operating following commercial rules, operating based on market orientations. And the Ministry of Finance may be the equity holders, etc. But I want to ask about the interest rate mechanism of the public development bank. In Vietnam, we have the Vietnam Development Bank, or VDB, operate similarly to an international development bank. They have access to ODA fund and climate fund in order to finance the green and sustainable growth roadmap of Vietnam. And then they also made up for their loss by the state budget on an annual basis. So I would like to learn from the experience, internationally speaking. So international development banks operate non-for-profit, and they need to balance their own finance areas, or they get subsidy from the government. So can we clarify on that, please?
Diana, I think perhaps you could, I mean, were you able to listen to the translation?
Yes. Do you want me to address that?
Yes.
Thank you.
So, I mean,
yes, it's a very good question, and in fact, I'm doing some research on that right now, in association with the Finance in Common initiative, which is being organized through the Development Bank in France, agency in France, partly recognizing the fact that there are many good examples of how public banks can operate, and we actually need to learn more from them and share them. Now, so your question is, how do really your question, if I've understood it, is how does a bank that is lending on concessional terms ensure its own long-term viability, and also the ability to lend to projects that may take a very long time to make a profit. And this is the purpose of these banks, of course, is to cover investments that the commercial sector is not able to address. So what does happen is that some banks, which are very undercapitalized for their task, which happens unfortunately a lot, partly as a hangover, I would say, from the previous period where governments were not really always fully committed to their public banks. So often they're undercapitalized for the heavy lifting that is required. And so what some banks try and do is they do a kind of a juggle where they have some investments that are supposed to be quite profitable, and they use the revenues from that to subsidize the more socially oriented loans that might take a long time to make a profit, or that in fact are highly grant-based in terms of the lending. So that is obviously a tightrope that is very difficult for these banks to follow. And what makes it more difficult for them too is that their government owners often require them to have a AAA credit rating. Now, the benefit of AAA credit rating is that you can borrow internationally at lower interest rates. Not all national development banks have that capacity because they can only borrow at the same interest rate as their government. And for that reason, many banks actually go in partnership with banks from other countries that are able to access international capital more cheaply. So that's another whole topic about the link with regional banks, or having a shareholder from another country that is able to raise your credit. But the point is that a bank that is trying to be AAA, because it's trying to borrow internationally to increase its capitalization or increase its lending power, they are therefore quite constrained in terms of what they can do in terms of lending. And there's a big debate going on about this internationally. Some of the credit rating agencies have said actually these banks could be more ambitious in their lending and not risk the AAA rating if we knew that the governments would really support the banks. So there's a kind of chicken and egg problem here, which is that the banks could be more courageous or could leverage more without risking the AAA rating, but they won't do it unless they know they've got the government supporting them. So that's one issue. The other issue is, do banks, can they get additional replenishments of capitalization? And in many banks that does happen. So they get annual replenishments, maybe from if there's a surplus of foreign reserves one particular year, or there is a budget surplus that can be directed to this, some trade finances, some revenues from commodity royalties, for example. These are all ways that national banks do get annual replenishments. And the argument is they need the replenishment because they're lending at highly concessional loans. So then that gets back to that question, I think, which our wonderful moderator asked before, which is, how do we make sure that these banks are not falling into some of the criticisms of the past of making poor lending decisions. And now we get into this question of the governance of the banks and the transparency of the decisions. And this is an area that it would be very helpful to have more discussion on. Now, one thing that can help the bank, which is trying to make a loan for some highly important and transitional project, would be if they had a guaranteed demand for what is the product of that loan. And this is where we get back to that question of the link with industrial policy. So, governments can have big procurement contracts to buy the product which is at the basis of the loan. So that can be a way that the bank can offer a concessional loan with some guarantee that it will actually get the revenues that are required to pay for it. The other thing that is very interesting is the way that sovereign wealth funds are used in many developing countries. We did some research into sovereign wealth funds from developing countries. There's more than $8 trillion held by these sovereign wealth funds. I think Vietnam also has such a fund. Most of these funds invest not in their country. They invest in advanced economies, and they often invest in things like real estate or finance, which is not necessarily going to get the highest return. And it's also not helping developmentally the country that actually owns these public assets. I mean, a sovereign wealth fund is a public asset. So they could be used in partnership maybe with these public banks, excuse me. And then also there's the question of partnering with private banks, because commercial banks have an important role to play too. So there's, there are many, many different models that can be used, but all of them need to have a well-capitalized public bank that has adequate funding for the task that's required. Thank you.
Thank you very much for comprehensive overview of the various types of public banks governance mechanism.
Hello, I'm Kian from Climate Change Resilience Center, and we are developing a voluntary emission trading system for Vietnam, which is for the carbon market. And we believe that the voluntary carbon market plays very important role in financing for climate change. My question and also we are working with, we are dealing with TN Power and VinFast, but it's at very early stage. And my question to the panel is, what do you think of the voluntary market for carbon credits? Maybe for BCG and CME solar power, they are a bit familiar. But also for Standard Chartered Bank, what do you think of the voluntary market? And maybe John, if you want to add something. Thank you.
Should I start first? Maybe from Standard Chartered's perspective. So you know what? Standard Chartered is so involved in voluntary carbon markets, as you know, with Mark Carney and Bill Winters. They lead the global, well, led, and we're very, very involved in actually setting up the frameworks of global carbon credits and also Standard Chartered together with Temasek, DBS set up CIX, and CIX set up the voluntary exchange in Singapore, right? Together with SGX. So yes, we believe in it. I think it's great, but let us not be blinded that it is going to take over. What is really fundamental is that we really need to have real organic change, right, in the way that we're managing climate change. I think carbon credit gives the focus on how much does it actually cost and what are you costing the planet, right? This and if you use, you pay. And what is the standards for how this is measured? We need international standards. So I commend you. It's great because we are having the same conversations with Monterey, right? Monterey is tasked with actually doing this together with, we've had our conversations with BIDV. I know Citibank is also involved, and I think everybody is working towards a framework. So, but what I would like to say is, please, when you build, please build to global standards. Please build to standards that global investors can understand, right? And think about a possibility where Vietnam comes up with their voluntary carbon markets. Indonesia has one, Malaysia has one. For example, what about combining all the exchanges so that you have depth and you have liquidity? I think that's impressive. So you have a proper Asian framework, for example, for voluntary carbon markets. It's a big topic by itself, not something that we discussed today, but so far that would be my comment. Thank you.
Right. For BCG, right, regarding to the carbon credit, yes, we do. We do register carbon credit. Of course, we know that BCG is also a partner with the subsidiary of Temasek and also a client of DBS. So we do register, and we are well aware of that, and we still believe something on that, because there's some day that you can exchange, the credit into that market, right? But of course, like you said, Michelle, is not going to change, and it has to come to a very, very fundamental change. That it has to be a real actions from a developer is actually move forward the zero carbon in the futures to be able to achieve that. So otherwise, let's just take for example, you have one country to trade the carbon credit with another country, like an exchange market, and that won't change. That should not be a message for that one.
We believe that carbon credit be added incentive for industry and investor to use renewable energies. We received the request from our client for the carbon credit in our project. And I think that a few days ago, the Prime Minister already approved the decision 888, in which in which one of the provision is that the carbon credit market must be established in Vietnam by I think in 2 years, I think so. And I think that is a good direction. And I also agree with Michelle that this market should be standardized internationally, so that it can facilitate the liquidation of this credit.
Xin mời các quý vị đại biểu. Có lẽ là mời chị có câu hỏi cuối cùng, thì cũng hơi muộn rồi. Mời chị ạ.
One last question because it's quite late already. This lady.
Khối dịch vụ tư vấn ngân hàng đầu tư của công ty chứng khoán Agribank. Hiện nay tôi thì có cái việc thu xếp vốn cho các cái
security
doanh nghiệp
company, and we arrange finance for companies joining in this field, and while the government and banks are providing a lot of finance to this area. However, well, when we arrange funding for these firms here, we encounter a significant challenge. So we don't use equipment from G7 countries, we use Chinese equipment, but then it's very difficult to obtain funding from the banks. They don't accept Chinese equipment. That is a big challenge, and we try to look for international fundings, but for the funds that offer good interest rate, they insist on turbines from G7 countries. So, well, I wonder if you and the banks here can offer any solutions to us. Like in Vietnam, there may be commercial banks who can offer very high interest rate because they say Chinese turbines are very risky. But we believe that Chinese turbine can offer very good quality. Then why do we have to suffer from high interest rate? That is a big challenge for us. And well, as a financier arranger, well, we would like to seek rationales from the banks explaining to us why it is the case. And well, we do know that public development banks have to go through a rigorous credit rating process, but in Vietnam it may be a new thing. How do we have credit ratings for the development public banks? Thank you.
The Chinese are very good at making equipment at different levels. You know, in Vietnam, we can buy a Chinese motorbike for $300. We can buy another one at $500. We can buy another one at $2,000. Okay, it's the same with renewable energy. Vestas, GE, their turbines come from Vietnam. I mean, from not Vietnam, from China. They're made in China. A lot of the solar panels are made in China. Now, Vietnam is developing a solar market, and right now, I can tell you it's a good time to buy Vietnamese because the cost of shipping has gone up so much that it's the international solar companies who used to manufacture in Vietnam and ship out, their solar panels are too expensive now because of the shipping costs. So they're really making some good deals now for you to buy. There's Canadian Solar, there's First Solar from the U.S. And when you come to your customers with this type of equipment, for example, these solar panels, they don't have the 6-month guarantee like the Chinese one do. They have a 12-year fully guarantee. They don't have just a 5 years performance guarantee. They have a 30-year performance guarantee. And both of such companies, they take back the solar panels and do a complete recycling of the solar panels. These are what the international investors are looking for. And you're paying, what we see, you're paying somewhere around 6-7% more. But over the lifetime, you're getting that money back very quick. So I would encourage you to look at Vietnam and look what Vietnam is producing now, because they're producing very high quality. And yes, you pay a little bit more for it, but in the long run, it's worth the investment as we see to do that. But it's like many things. A lot of people don't have the money to pay. You know, my wife is Vietnamese. We have a high-rise house. I try to talk to her all the time. We need the water pump that goes, you know, and let's go buy one from Grundfos. Lasts forever. No, that's too expensive. We just buy this Chinese one. And I said, yeah, but it only lasts a year or so. Yeah, we buy another one. We can buy 10. We can buy 10 for that. So it's a challenge.
Yeah, so it's quite interesting questions actually, because like us as a local developer, of course, we develop wind, and we do have various different kind of turbine. And do we face the challenge if we use the one that not in G7? I don't believe so, because Right now, right, even though we know that in the market, a lot of the Chinese turbine, when we choose a turbine, it's not just because of the country. So I'm not being biased here. So it's regarding to, it is the game of the supply chain sometimes. In the past as well, when when the pricing in the feed-in tariff end on October last year, it's the game of the supply chain. Why do we have to follow that game, right? As a local developer, we choose with different factor. The availabilities, of course, the stage sustainabilities of the turbine as well, and pricings as well. We have too many constraints of wind portfolio, but yes, for ourselves like BCG, do we face, so we choose, actually our projects are use Chinese turbine in some of our projects. We use Siemens Gamesa in the futures, we will. But do we face the bankability if we use the Chinese turbine right now? For us, no. Because, of course, for local developer, right, or any different developer will be very creative on different kind, and we seek, and we know that in the market, like for example, if we can't go to ADB, we go to Sinosure. We can't go to a Western bank, we go to Chinese bank. So it's a for us, we know there are, of course, some of the ECA financing in the past that will not support if we use some of these turbine, let's say not in G7 or from Chinese turbine, let's say for example, but the perception has changed. And we still believe that there are still ways to develop our wind with different methods, with different, financing in the world.
It's also one of the key items that the private sector is asking Vietnam about. We need standards. We need standards for the equipment coming to this country, so that you don't run into problems like that. That Vietnam has the standards for a solar panel. They have the standards, and these are international standards. So unfortunately, what probably hurts too is we've had bad press about a number of completed projects. Big storms coming in and just wiping out a solar farm. That wouldn't have happened if it was built to international standards. That we have, unfortunately, turbines that caught on fire. Again, this doesn't happen if there are standards for these things. So I know Vietnam is working on it, and it's a big job to make these things. It costs tens of millions of dollars for these things, but we need these so that you don't run into problems like that.
Thank you. Xin mời các quý vị đại biểu, có lẽ là nếu mà không có quý vị nào có câu hỏi gì nữa thì xin phép được
then I would like to express my sincere thanks to all of you. Xin cảm ơn tất cả các quý vị.
So overwhelmed with all the information. So thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you, Diana, for staying with us all the way. Thank you very much. And we obviously have listened to so many interesting perspectives, but I think the key messages here is still, how do we have the collective inspiration to move ourselves forwards, and how do we change and reform some of the enabling policies from in the legal framework, so that private businesses can come in and start operating and stay operating. So I suppose this is probably one of our key messages for the roundtable. And I mean, this is again, I think, as when I approached Vietnam Investment Review to co-host this roundtable, we indicate that this is only the very beginning of a long series of discussion, because there's still quite a lot to do. So thank you, Mr. Minh from Vietnam Investment Review, for agreeing to host this important topic with us, and thank you to the audience for staying very late on Friday afternoon, and most of all, thank you to our panelists for very interesting exchanges, and we hope to be able to work together with everybody to for a better energy future.
Thank you.